Hello, my name is Irene Ordax and I will be presenting the next question. To what extent is Brian Aldiss' definition of science fiction, hubris clobbered by nemesis, the definitive one? Now, to define science fiction is one of the most difficult tasks in literature. Unlike other literature genres, sci-fi cannot be contained in a specific period or a specific format. This makes the creation of a definition nearly impossible. But in 1986, in his book Trillion Year Spree, Brian Aldiss wrote his definition of sci-fi: hubris clobbered by nemesis. Brian Aldiss died early this year in 2017, and he was known mainly for his work in science fiction with books such as Nonstop or Grey Bear. He is also known for his many essays about this genre and his contributions to the better understanding of the subject, often praised by authors such as Neil Gaiman. In this recording, we will ask ourselves if science fiction can truly be defined, and if it can, if the definition given by Aldiss can be applied. Now, first, we should ask ourselves, what is science fiction? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as fiction dealing principally with the impact of actual or imagined science on society or individuals, or having a scientific factor as an essential orienting component. It is a complete and accurate definition of the genre, but rather simple for a narrative that's been existing for more than 100 years and continues to evolve. Neil Gaiman writes, "Personally, I tend to define science fiction as anything I'm pointing at when I say, yup, that's sci-fi. It's easier that way." After all, maybe we cannot put into words what sci-fi is, but we know what it is, right? In the best sci-fi movies of all time, made by Rotten Tomatoes, all the Star Wars episodes get a mention. However, in the Cinefix list of best sci-fi films, they don't include this title, and they put the Star Wars in the best Western list instead. Indeed, many consider Star Wars to follow more a pattern of Westerns or fantasy films, rather than science fiction. Of course, the two genres are not that different. Like Miriam Allen IV says, science fiction deals with improbable possibilities, fantasy with plausible impossibilities. We may say that Star Wars does not apply to the genre of science fiction because while it does imagine certain technologies and certain alien races, like many other sci-fi works, it doesn't actually deal with what we could call real science or has a particular scientific factor that the story focuses on, which is not an essential orienting component like the Merriam-Webster definition asks. Still, it is for debate. Now, since we already stated that it is hard to define science fiction, and that it is something that we may know what it is, but we don't know exactly how to put it into words, it's when hubris clobbered by nemesis enters. Now, to fully understand the sentence, we first need to understand the context in which it was written. Now, we started this recording by asking ourselves, is Brian Aldiss' definition was the definitive one? The problem is that he himself doesn't fully considers it as a definition. Indeed, Aldiss writes in his book, "There is not such entity as science fiction. We have only the work of many men and women which, for convenience, we can group together under the label science fiction. Many dislike that label, many glory in it." Indeed, this is a genre impossible to fully define, and it is more a label that we like to put on certain work. That the problem of that label is that everything can go there. So, for instance, the movie Children of Men, which deals with the question what would happen if suddenly no one is born, will be put in the same category as, for instance, the other movie or even the book 2001 A Space Odyssey that deals with the existence of life outside Earth and what it will mean for the creation of humans and even with artificial intelligence. Now, of course, we can see that these two works have a similar theme, in this case, humanity as a whole. One, because one asks what happens when humanity has no longer a future, and the other one asks why are we here and how humanity advances. But even then, we have to admit that these two works put under the same level are quite different. Now, after this commentary, the first definition that he writes is science fiction is the search for the definition of mankind and his status in the universe, which will stand in our advanced but confused state of knowledge, science, and it's characteristically cast in the Gothic or post-Gothic mode. So we all agree, even him, because he wrote before, the following definition may sound slightly pretentious for a genre that had its strong font side, but we can modify it as we go along. So yes, we can all agree that this is a long definition with many details. Not only that, but even in the definition it is acknowledged the origin of science fiction, with many scholars consider it to be Mary Shelley's Gothic novel Frankenstein. But still, it is way too detailed. This is when he resumes all this part of the search of mankind for its place in the world and our position as simply hubris clobbered by nemesis. Now, again, to fully understand the definition of hubris clobbered by nemesis, let's look first at its separate parts. Now, first, hubris. Hubris is simply defined by the Merriam-Webster as exaggerated pride or self-confidence. Again, the definition of the dictionary is way too simple for such a vast term. Indeed, the Greek used to describe this as not only exaggerated pride or overconfidence, but it was to an extreme where it defies the laws of nature and challenges the gods. Indeed, people suffering from hubris are people that believe that their capacities go beyond the laws of nature and that they are equal or even superior to God. Now, the concept of hubris has existed long before the birth of science fiction, and they often punish many of their characters in the mythology from suffering for that. One of the most famous characters that would be punished for that will be the Greek hero Belafonte that was riding Pegasus. So this hero showed great hubris because he thought he could arrive to the Olympus and be considered almost like a god. But unfortunately, Bellerophonte died because Zeus, seeing this hero trying to defeat him, just threw away one of his thunders, killing him immediately. Now there's other examples of extreme hubris in Greek mythology, but the main point of it is that they defy the laws of the gods. And in a much modern usage, it defies the laws of God, or in general, it defies the laws of nature. Now, we could say that the original science fiction novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is the perfect example of this tendency. After all, Dr. Frankenstein tries to create life through his monster. This is why he's also called the modern Prometheus. But he's just a man. And by trying to defy the laws of nature and by creating life, he creates what will be his final doom. Now, clobber is defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary as to pound mercilessly, to hit with force, to defeat overwhelmingly, to have a strongly negative impact on, or to criticize harshly. So it is indeed a rather negative idea, the idea of something hitting or something defeating. And then nemesis. Now, nemesis kind of goes back to your definition of hubris. Because indeed, nemesis is what happens to people suffering from hubris. So, in the case of the previous hero that we mentioned before, Bellerophonte, his nemesis came when Zeus hit him with his thunder and he died. So, that was his nemesis. Now, nemesis was a goddess and he was like the personification of this concept. So basically the idea of hubris clobbered by nemesis is the idea of this extreme arrogance against nature, being that provokes this fall of our characters, of humanity, that provokes this retribution, but this retribution hit hard. So now that we understand the definition, we may think, considering if this definition is real, what works that we may consider sci-fi do not fall under this category, or what works that we definitely not consider as sci-fi may actually fall in this category. So for instance, we know for a fact that the original sci-fi novel, Frankenstein, it is actually the perfect example of the definition of hubris clobbered by nemesis, because indeed when Frankenstein defies the laws of nature by creating life, creating his monster, his retribution came in the form of the monster killing his loved ones and finally be the cause of his own death. We can also apply this to many dystopias also considered usually in the genre, like for instance Blade Runner. Similar to what we discussed before, humans created these replicant beings, not humans, but beings with the same feelings and the same desires, and then humans began to be murdered by these replicants because all these replicants wanted was the possibility to live longer and to have the same opportunities as humans to explore themselves and their lives. Again, is the arrogance of humanity, the arrogance of creating life, what caused all this trouble. Another example, Fahrenheit 451. So in that novel, humans just began to stop reading. They began to ignore all knowledge. They began to stop seeking for knowledge. Therefore, they start feeling stupid, and instead of trying to surpass that feeling, they decided that they should just prohibit all search of knowledge. Ironically, we may think that this example actually works the other way around. It was the lack of any pride, of any search for anything that caused all that trouble. Now, going to a more extreme of an example that would definitely not fall under this category, you could find, for instance, the TV series Star Trek. Now, many do agree that Star Trek does fall in the genre of science fiction, because unlike its counterpart Star Wars, it does use a much more science base, and it does occur in our galaxy, since planet Earth does appear, unlike in the galaxy of Star Wars. But in that, how could we apply the definition of hubris clobbered by nemesis? Not only it is hard to even apply a definition to a TV series that works by episode, but even looking at a single one, it is usually a completely different story, and all the advancements that humanity and other alien species have achieved in science is not seen as foolish pride or a defiance against the laws of nature, but more like something good and positive. So we could argue that indeed not all science fiction would fall under that category. And on the other way, a billion stories actually fell under that definition. Hubris clobbered by nemesis, well, like we said before, practically covers all of the Greek mythology, where they try to punish humans for trying to defy the gods. It also covered even modern work, like in the Stanley Kubrick movie Barry Lyndon. Barry is a man that, for showing his excessive pride, for trying to show off his money, and for believing he's better than others, he ends up losing everything he has, including his son, his wife, and his leg. The problem with that is that we cannot definitely put that work in the science fiction part because that work occurs after Napoleonic Wars, so it is a historical film, not a sci-fi film. So I guess the problem with Alice's definition is that not all sci-fi could enter the definition, and a lot of non-sci-fi could actually enter. Now, still, this doesn't mean that we need to just put away Alice's definition. We do need to take in account the root. One, his definition definitely takes into a negative impact. Hubris clobbered by nemesis is definitely not positive outlook into the sci-fi story. We also need to take into account what does this mean science. Indeed, science, this vision of the future, these inventions, this essential part in this literature is usually seen by our society as something positive, as the advancement of humanity. But in many science fiction works, and like this definition implies, science can also mean in some way our doom. When humans try to arrive way faster than they can understand, that's where the problems begin. So if we take, for instance, an historical example, let's say the invention of the atomic bomb. So the whole theory of atoms and nuclear energy was known before. It was decided by the time of the World War II that it could be applied. It was indeed said that the Germans were practicing it first, so this is why the United States hurried to also try to develop this weapon. Even after Germany lost, the United States still decided to continue with the plan, and they dropped 2 atomic bombs over Japan without knowing their effects, only knowing what their basic tests in the desert have been. And after they dropped the bombs, they finally understood what humanity, what science was actually capable. The quantity of destruction, and not only the destruction after the immediate aftermath of the dropping of the bombs, but also all the problems of health that came after and that are affecting even today. Now, considering this real life example, we could argue that indeed this warning that science fiction apparently is trying to make, or at least according to Alice's definition, is quite necessary. And we need to stop and think, with all these advancements, are we really understanding what we're doing? Are we defying the laws of nature? Are we really not focusing so much or not thinking that we are only mere human? And by defying this concept, by trying to be more than we are, we're actually dooming ourselves. So, what can we conclude with all of this? It is impossible to define science fiction. It is impossible to agree on one single definition. Each work needs to be considered individually, and each work possesses a different message. But this does not mean that we need to just discard all this definition just by saying, well, it's impossible to define. Because even though hubris clobbered by nemesis is at the same time way too general to only occupy the sci-fi genre, but at the same time too specific to occupy the whole sci-fi genre, we have to admit the true nature of the definition. And the true nature of the definition is this fear that science is advancing way much faster than human thinking and that human reasoning. Science is way beyond our capacities, and therefore science and this human advancement could be our doom. The hubris of the entire world, the hubris of humans of thinking that we are the superior species of a planet, and that therefore we have the right to keep inventing and inventing and inventing without stopping to considering what are the consequences of what are we invented, is what will cause our nemesis. Thank you.